Hello and welcome to the Storm of Scripture. In this lesson, we're looking at a passage from Isaiah where he blends prophecy about Assyria in his immediate context with prophecies about God's ultimate vindication of his righteous people and the ultimate demise of all the wicked at the very end of days. Along the way, he brings in images starting with the chaos waters of Genesis chapter 1, through the prophecy against the gods of the nations in Psalm 82, and all the way to the New Jerusalem that appears when the first heaven and the first earth have passed away, and a new heaven and new earth appear. Thank you for joining me as we examine the treasures in Isaiah chapters 24 through chapter 27. Let's walk through it at the high level as we have done each time. In chapter 24, there's a vision of God pouring out judgment on earth and heaven. And as he did with Tyre, he picks up this picture with the earth already desolate, already destroyed. Verses 1 through 13 is that picture of a desolate earth that God has made so because of the defilement of the people who live on it. The verses 14 through 16 are a positive note in which somebody, it just says they, we don't have a name or even an identity of who it is acting in these verses, but they're singing. They could be angels. It could be the righteous people. It just says they sing. They sing for joy because of this day of destruction, presumably, since that's the context. But the reason they would sing with joy, even in the midst of desolation, is that they know that the destruction of the wicked is also the time of vindication for the righteous. So even though chapter 24 is predominantly about this judgment and the destruction and devastation that comes from God's judgment, this middle section, verses 14 through 16, are a note of hope from an unknown group, but probably people who are celebrating righteousness because they are righteous before God in one way or another, and that the judgment on the earth as a whole will mean vindication for them. The note of desolation and destruction resumes with verse 17 through the end of the chapter at verse 23. This is an affirmation that the desolation of the earth is judgment from heaven, but it doesn't stop on the earth because there's also judgment in heaven against what one must assume are unfaithful heavenly beings, otherwise they would not deserve judgment. In chapter 25, there is a contrast between blessings on Zion and the trampling and destruction of Moab. It may seem odd for Moab to come here. I think it just serves a particular image of one mountain versus another, as the mountains of Moab are contrasted with the mountain of Zion. But this whole chapter reads like a psalm. If you didn't know better and you just had the text of chapter 25, I think if you just read it, you'd think this came from the Psalms, because it reads like one. It's like a psalm glorifying God for his deeds, protecting the poor and the needy while bringing judgment on the wicked. It also looks forward to the day when all wickedness and death will be removed from the earth, leaving only gladness and life. And this psalm-like content continues through chapters 26 and 27, which is primarily focused on the protection and restoration of Zion and the praise to God for having done that. So chapter 26, 1 through 19, does read like another psalm. The chapter praises God for building up a strong city in Judah. It never names this strong city, but it's clearly Jerusalem. And the section includes a promise of resurrection. That's another area that we're going to look at in detail when we get to the verse by verse. From chapter 26, verse 20 through the end of chapter 27, there's a shift back to a prophetic picture about what's going to happen, rather than up to this point, it has sort of been envisioned as having already happened, and we're kind of looking at the aftermath of God's destruction and power. But here, from verse 26:20 on to chapter 27 is a focus on what's coming in the future, a warning about that day of wrath, and encouraging the faithful to wait through that destruction for their deliverance. That deliverance will ultimately result in their worshiping God in Jerusalem. I probably should have pointed out from the beginning that this section is a shift and a continuation. It's a continuation of the prophetic word about God's justice and the day of the Lord that is coming in the future. But in the previous section, from chapters 13 through 23, there was a blending of this eternal or ultimate judgment with judgment on individual nations like Tyre and Babylon. Here, from chapter 24 through 27, there's not so much blending. It's all just about God's ultimate wrath in the end, how he's going to bring that judgment. Some of it might be applied in the here and now, in the sense that God's judgment can fall on any wicked nation, whether we give it a name or not in the scripture. But it also is very focused on that end times judgment, when everything is made right and the righteous are fully vindicated and the wicked are completely eliminated. Speaking of being completely eliminated, let's start looking at the verse by verse with the first 3 verses of chapter 24. Behold, the Lord will empty the earth and make it desolate, and he will twist its surface and scatter its inhabitants. And it shall be as with the people, so with the priest. As with the slave, so with his master. As with the maid, so with her mistress. As with the buyer, so with the seller. As with the lender, so with the borrower. As with the creditor, so with the debtor. The earth shall be utterly empty and utterly plundered, for the Lord has spoken this word. It's a remarkable statement that everybody is going away. If we just read it at the surface level, it sounds like there's absolutely nobody left. It's completely devoid of inhabitants. Utterly empty, it says. There's nobody living on the surface of the planet anymore. But that's probably just a little bit of an exaggeration. But the point is that God's judgment is going to fall on everyone, no matter your social standing, no matter your occupation. That's the point of this middle section. As it shall be with the people, so with the priest. Being a priest doesn't give you any special out. You're going to be treated just like anybody else, no matter what you are, whether you're the slave or the master. The slave isn't going to be able to say, well, it's my master's fault. Don't judge me. It's somebody else's fault. I was just a slave. But the master's not going to have any special position either for wealth and position. That's not going to get him out. Everybody is going to face this judgment. And everyone who is wicked is going to be swept away. This dramatic picture of the earth being so totally desolated that it's practically uninhabited is not unique to Isaiah. It is a rhetorical stance of prophetic word in other places as well. One place that came to my mind as I was reading through this is in Zephaniah. Zephaniah opens his prophecy from the very beginning with a similar kind of picture. This is Zephaniah chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. I will utterly sweep away everything from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. I will sweep away man and beast. I will sweep away the birds of the heavens and the fish of the sea, the rubble with the wicked. I will cut off mankind from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. The same kind of idea. God is going to just clean house, and when he cleans house, there's no one left. It's completely empty. This is a dramatic position. Obviously, God is going to judge. We have other pictures of God judging. It's not going to be so complete that there is absolutely no one alive. In the book of Revelation, we have a different kind of picture where there is sweeping judgment on the earth, but it isn't so much that absolutely every last person is gone. But I think both Isaiah and Zephaniah are using this image to get the audience, the listener, to sit up and take notice and think, what are you saying? God's just going to wipe everything out? It gets your attention to listen to what's going on and the explanation for why he's going to judge so harshly and what one might do, if anything, to avoid getting swept away along with absolutely everything else. John says that he saw the first heaven and the first earth pass away, and there's a new heaven and a new earth. I think they could be connected, and the old earth being completely empty before it is swept away. In Revelation, there's not only the end of the 1,000 years, but there's also the great white throne of judgment. There's people being thrown into the lake of fire. Then there's the new heaven and the new earth, which appear almost simultaneously with the New Jerusalem. That all is all tied in together. And I'm not sure exactly how literal we're going to take the new heaven and the new earth as far as whether the actual molecules of the current earth are going to be gone and something else is going to replace it, like the physical body itself, or whether it's just talking about a complete and utter renovation of what's there. And I don't know that we will know the difference between one or the other until it actually happens. And then we can observe what it means for the first heaven and the first earth to pass away and the new earth to appear. Until it happens, I'm not sure we're going to have some materialistic explanation for what that really means. But I do think the ideas could be connected in the sense that God is going to start over with creation. If we read more through Zephaniah, we would get the sense that what Zephaniah is describing is like a new flood, new Noah flood that completely eradicates the face of the earth with something new. A lot of the language from Zephaniah's first chapter is influenced by the language of Genesis chapters 6 and 7 with the coming of the flood. So there is a picture of the whole earth sort of being reset to zero and then starting over. And yes, that could very well be behind the wording in Revelation 21 about a new heaven and a new earth and the first heaven and the first earth passing away. Well, the big question that one needs to know is why? Why is God desolating the entire earth? What's going on here? Isaiah gives us that answer in Isaiah 24, verses 5 and 6. The earth lies defiled under its inhabitants, for they have transgressed the laws, violated the statutes, broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore, a curse devours the earth, and its inhabitants suffer for their guilt. Therefore, the inhabitants of the earth are scorched, and few men are left. At least here we get a few men left. But for the most part, the earth is defiled and desolated. And why? Because of the inhabitants of the earth. The fact that the people who live on the earth are violating their laws and covenant with God is a curse on the earth. The earth is suffering destruction because of what the people living on it have done. And this is a connection and relationship between the people and the earth that is hinted at several points in Scripture. It becomes a kind of thread which we can pull on. It's not in every single book. It's not in every single chapter. We're not going to find this idea, but every once in a while, it bubbles up to the surface that there's a connection between what people do on the earth and the earth itself. And that connection begins right at the beginning in Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 17, God says to Adam, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. The ground didn't do anything, and yet the ground gets cursed because of what Adam and Eve did with the fruit of the tree. This curse makes the earth produce thorns and thistles, as the next verse would talk about, making it difficult for Adam to cultivate and grow the crops that he needs to live. That is part of the curse. But notice what is cursed is not Adam, but the ground. The ground is cursed because of Adam. And this is not a one-time deal. It comes up again in Leviticus in a slightly different way. In Leviticus chapter 18, verses 24 through 25, do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things that he's been mentioning in Leviticus 18, which is primarily sexual ethics and what you should and should not do that way. But he says, don't make yourselves unclean by any of these things, for by all these the nations I am driving out before you have become unclean, and the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity, the land's iniquity. And the land vomited out its inhabitants. As if the land is saying, I don't need this anymore. I'm done with you guys because God is punishing me on your behalf. So you get out of here. The land got rid of the inhabitants of Canaan because of what they were doing and how what they were doing was affecting the land itself. The land became unclean. The land didn't want to be unclean, so it got rid of the inhabitants in the land. This is somewhat like what we're reading in Isaiah, except there is no place to go. As Isaiah says, the whole earth lies defiled under its inhabitants. So there is no place on earth that is not defiled by the people who live on it, because all the people who live on it have transgressed the laws, violated the statutes, and broken the everlasting covenant. There is hope, however, for the earth and for the inhabitants. And Paul talks about it in the book of Romans. In Romans chapter 8, verses 20 and 21, Paul wrote, "For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God." So the creation itself is under this futility. I take that to read all the way back to Genesis and the ground being cursed, and influenced by this same idea as Leviticus would put it, or Isaiah, that the iniquity of the people who live on the land is corrupting the land itself. The creation is subjected to it, not on its own accord, not willingly. The earth doesn't want to be there, but it suffers because of the people who live on it. It's going to be freed from its bondage to corruption through the children of God. It's as if the creation will be redeemed by the people who are living on it, just as it has been corrupted by the people who are living on it. So when the people who live on the earth are children of God and living in the new creation, then the creation will no longer be subjected to futility because the people who are living on it are no longer corrupting it. It is redeemed. I don't know that this has anything to say about modern ecological conservation and all of that, except that what we do as people on the earth does affect the earth. And we should be aware of that. And whether it's moral corruption or physical corruption, pollution, what we do affects where we live. And we should be concerned about it at all levels, moral and physical. Let's move on to another section in Isaiah 24, verses 21 through 23. On that day, the Lord will punish the host of heaven in heaven, and the kings of the earth on the earth. They will be gathered together as prisoners in a pit. They will be shut up in a prison, and after many days they will be punished. Then the moon will be confounded, and the sun ashamed, for the Lord of hosts reigns in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and his glory will be before his elders. This is that section where I was alluding to earlier when we went through the overview, where it's not just on earth that the desolation happens and the punishment, but in heaven. As verse 21 says, on that day the Lord will punish the host of heaven in heaven. The host of heaven is a way to refer to the stars, but it also refers to heavenly beings like we would call angels, supernatural beings. But why would God punish supernatural beings? The only way to square that is to say that the supernatural beings have been rebellious, just as the kings of the earth have been. In fact, there is a relationship between the kings of the earth and the host of heaven in the sense that some of the host of heaven have been given authority over nations on the earth. This is a inference from Deuteronomy chapter 32 and some Second Temple literature. Deuteronomy 32 talks about God dividing the nations, and although it doesn't say it's at the Tower of Babel, the phrasing there about God dividing the nations is the same phrasing that occurs in Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel and the tongues being divided and the people going their own ways into the various nations of the earth. That phrasing from Genesis 11 is also in Deuteronomy 32. And in Deuteronomy 32, it says that God divided the nations according to the sons of God, which is a term referring to these divine beings or angelic type beings. So if he is dividing the nations according to the number of the sons of God, then there's a suggestion that there are these divine beings, these angelic beings that are over certain nations. And there's a relationship between some of the heavenly hosts, we might say, and the kings of the earth. And Isaiah 24:21 is also a place where we get these things coming together. The Lord will punish the hosts of heaven in the heavens and the kings of the earth on the earth. Both sides of the equation, in other words, the supernatural side and the natural side, are all going to get what they deserve for rebelling against God. Let's read Psalm 82. It's short, so I'm going to read the entire psalm. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Salah. Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods, Son of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die, and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, and judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. We see elements of what I was just describing that's implied by Deuteronomy 32 and alluded to perhaps in Isaiah 24:1, this connection between the nations and the divine beings, the gods, the sons of the Most High. When God judges all the earth and punishes the hosts of heaven, he is going to inherit all the nations. None of the nations will be under any other divine being, any other supernatural being. They will all be directly under God. The sons of the Most High that have been rebellious will die just like any person would. This is, I believe, part of this in Isaiah. The Lord is going to punish the hosts of heaven and the kings of the earth. They will be gathered together as prisoners in a pit. They'll be shut up in prison, and then after many days they will be punished. That to me is the same thing as what we're reading about at the end of Psalm 82. God is judging the heavens and the kings of the earth together. Some people will say that Psalm 82 lets people off the hook because it's only talking about God judging angelic supernatural beings, but that's not exactly right because the people, the nations, are judging unjustly and showing partiality. And it's the problem is that these angelic beings that are responsible for the nations aren't doing anything about it. They are letting all of that happen. They are not imparting knowledge or understanding to the people they should be. And so God is going to judge them. In Isaiah, we read about these kings of the earth and the host of heaven together being gathered as prisoners in a pit, waiting for a time in the future when they will be punished. I think this is alluded to in 1 Peter chapter 3, in verses 18 through 20. Peter says this, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water." I want to focus on the spirits in prison idea because Isaiah emphasizes this idea of these supernatural beings and the kings of the earth all being gathered together in a prison. I think that this phrasing in 1 Peter alludes to the same idea of the spirits in prison. It's interesting the phrasing he uses here. If one does a study on the word that he uses for spirit in this place and some of the context, this is a word that can apply equally to a human spirit or to a supernatural spirit. There are other words he could have used to proclaim to the souls of men in prison, or he could have used a word for like angelos, the angels in prison. He could have used a word that was explicitly one or the other, human or supernatural in origin, but he uses this word pneuma that applies to both. And it's ambiguous as to whether he's talking about spirits of people or spirits of the spiritual realm. And I think that's intentionally ambiguous because I think he's alluding to exactly the same situation as Isaiah. Both the host of heaven and the kings of the earth are together, gathered together as prisoners in a pit. But whether it was during the 3 days when he was in the tomb or when he was resurrected, Jesus goes to proclaim to the spirits in prison. I believe he's proclaiming that the time for their punishment is at hand. Maybe it isn't immediate, but like Isaiah said, after many days, they will be punished. They're in prison for a while, but then their punishment is coming. And I believe that Jesus went to proclaim to those spirits in prison that their punishment was imminent. Peter isn't addressing what happened to the righteous dead. He's addressing Jesus going to the spirits in prison, and to be in prison is to be in the same group that Isaiah is describing. I believe Isaiah is describing this same prison in Isaiah 24. They'll be gathered together as prisoners in a pit, the host of heaven and the kings of the earth. And by the way, some of this is echoed in the book of First Enoch. The idea of supernatural beings and natural leaders, like the kings, being put in the same holding cell, as it were, holding them for punishment in the future. That's in First Enoch. And of course, the idea of the host being rebellious and connected to Noah, as Peter connects them to, is in Enoch because it's referring back to Genesis chapter 6 and the sons of God there also being supernatural beings. I might as well read that passage while we're in the wheelhouse. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were in the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. There is debate about what the sons of God are, but the book of First Enoch takes them as supernatural beings. I don't see any reason not to as well, because the sons of God phrasing does get applied to supernatural beings in other places. And that would also tie in with Peter and the spirits in prison being rebellious in the days of Noah, not obeying. Jude also connects to the same idea. I had not expected to find this passage in Isaiah tie in so completely with what I already had understood from Peter and from Psalm 82 and the whole Deuteronomy 32 worldview. And here it was in Isaiah in a somewhat unexpected place, talking about God punishing both the host of heaven and the kings of men. Let's look at Isaiah 25, verses 6 through 8. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine well refined. And he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. And the Lord God will wipe away the tears from all faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth. For the Lord has spoken. Notice that repeated word. The Lord has spoken, or the Lord has spoken this word, this affirmation that God's will is set, is resolute, and these outcomes are inevitable. We may not know exactly how or when, but the outcome will happen. And here the outcome is a feast on the mountain of the Lord. That would be Mount Zion, Jerusalem. It's an interesting play on words because the people are feasting on food. That means they're eating it, they're swallowing the food. Well, God is going to swallow something. He's going to swallow death. God is going to swallow up death and the veil that is cast over all peoples. Now, it could be that the veil is death itself. Sometimes we call dying crossing the veil. That image may be what we're talking about, that the covering on all people is death. I wonder if it could also mean the rakia separation between what is above and below, the heavens above and the earth below. The firmament, as it's sometimes translated, the word is rakia in Hebrew, and it's a separation between the waters that are above and the waters below, but it is kind of this separator between heavens and earth. And I'm wondering if maybe that is not implied by God taking away this covering that is over all the people. Now, it doesn't use the word rakia here at all. The word for covering and the word for veil are not related to that same word, but to me, we're in the wheelhouse of this idea of something covering up all the nations. And that covering is somehow dividing us apart from God, and God is going to take that division away. Death is also one thing that separates us from each other. Death may not separate us from God's presence because God is in Sheol as he is on earth and in heaven. There is a psalm that talks about if I wanted to run away from God and I would run to Sheol, I would find you there because you're already there. So God is everywhere. Death is not going to separate us from God, but it does separate us from each other. Well, God is going to remove all of those divisions. What separates heaven from earth and the living from the dead, all of it's going to be eliminated. God is going to swallow up death, and then he is going to wipe away the tears from all the people, from all the faces. This is beautifully picked up on and reused in Revelation, talking about that new heaven and new earth. That takes us to Revelation chapter 21, verses 1 through 4. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, maybe made completely desolate, as we read about at the beginning of Isaiah 24. But they're gone, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. To me, that is God swallowing up the separation, the covering, swallowing up the veil over all the nations. There's going to be no more division between us and the presence of God. And then we get the exact allusion back to Isaiah. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. God is going to swallow up death too. Neither shall there be mourning or crying nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. This is the ultimate hope. This is why, in the middle of the devastation, those unknown people can sing with joy about God's coming, because even though all of the former things are passing away and the first earth is being eliminated, it's not the end for those who are with God, because God's dwelling place will be with them, and then death will be no more, and God will wipe away every tear. I wanted to share a couple of verses from chapter 26. They are just such perfect memory verses. If I was going to pick like a memory verse from this section of Isaiah, it would be Isaiah 26, verse 3. Here is Isaiah 26, verses 3 and 4. You keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you. Trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord God is an everlasting rock. I need to commit that verse to memory, because I need to meditate on God. And if I will keep God in my mind, he will keep me in perfect peace. That's your memory verse for the day. Let's look at Isaiah 26, verses 13 through 15. O Lord, our God, other lords besides you have ruled over us, but your name alone we bring to remembrance. They are dead. They will not live. They are shades. They will not arise. To that end you have visited them with destruction and wiped out all remembrance of them. But you have increased the nation, O Lord. You have increased the nation. You are glorified. You have enlarged all the borders of the land. When Isaiah says other lords besides you have ruled over us, I think he's talking about the foreign lords. And he's in Judah, and at this time, Assyria has certainly exerted an inordinate amount of influence over Judah through Ahaz and other kings after him. So Assyria's rule, while not absolute, as Babylon's would be, has been quite influential. So Isaiah may be thinking about the king of Assyria as an indirect lord over the people of Judah. But of course, they have been under kings as well, and they're dead too. They may rise again in the resurrection that was just hinted at in the previous passage we looked at. But as far as our day-to-day existence, they're not coming back. They're dead. And what can we do? They're not around anymore. But God is, and God always has been. We get a little bit here of the same idea that I suggested was part of Isaiah chapter 6. Because back in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1 talks about that being the year that King Uzziah died. And in the year that King Uzziah died, Isaiah saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Then in Isaiah 6, verse 5, Isaiah says, Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Referring to God as the King in this particular way is unusual, and I believe is meant to draw us to the attention of the fact that the king is dead. King Uzziah, but the king still lives, which is the king, the Lord. It doesn't matter what earthly king may be living or dead, because the Lord of hosts is the king that is always alive and is always on the throne. And I think that's what we get from Isaiah 26 as well. Yes, we have other lords, we have other kings, but God is the one who is always on the throne and whose blessing really counts. It was the Lord who has increased the nation, not King Ahaz, not even King David or King Solomon. It's the Lord. He is the one who has given blessing to the nation, and he is the one who deserves remembrance, not those earthly kings. Here's Isaiah chapter 26, verses 16 through 19. O Lord, in distress they sought you. The people who are seeking out the Lord, they're having trouble, but they are seeking out the Lord in the process. O Lord, in distress they sought you. They poured out a whispered prayer when your discipline was upon them. Like a pregnant woman who writhes and cries out in her pangs when she's near to giving birth, so were we because of you, O Lord. We were pregnant, we writhed, but we've given birth to the wind. We have accomplished no deliverance in the earth, and the inhabitants of the world have not fallen. Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy. For your dew is a dew of light, and the earth will give birth to the dead. So I think there's a lot to unpack here, but apparently we are dealing with people who are in distress. They're seeking the Lord, and they are so distressed that they are writhing in pain, but that writhing in pain doesn't do any good. They're worried, they're anxious, and they really didn't need to be. Their worry hasn't accomplished anything. Their worry has done no good but given birth to wind, to nothing. They haven't accomplished any deliverance on their own. I think the inhabitants of the world that have not fallen are probably their adversaries that they were wanting to overcome. They wanted those inhabitants to fall, but they didn't. But they don't need to worry and be anxious because God has everything under control, and even death is not the end. Even if in the middle of their pain and suffering they do die, that is not the end of the story, because in God, his dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy, says Isaiah. Even death is not the end. This is a remarkable resurrection passage. Some have noted and comment about how resurrection isn't part of the Old Testament narrative, but yes, it is. And here in Isaiah 26, we see it. It is a promise that those who are seeking the Lord, even though they die, while they are seeking God, they will live. Their bodies shall rise. Like the promise that Christ gave when he said that he was the resurrection and the life. And if you die, you yet will live because of Christ. This is a similar affirmation that death is not the end for those who love the Lord. We can tie this back to that previous passage of God swallowing death. Swallowing death means nobody will die from that point forward. But here in Isaiah 26, we have the absolute promise that even those who have died will be brought to life and awake and sing with joy. It's Isaiah chapter 27, verse 1. In that day, the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. Gotta love a verse which has God slaying dragons. Leviathan is a picture of a sea serpent, a sea monster that God has defeated and will defeat. Leviathan being equated with a sea serpent and the chaotic power of the sea, and God defeating Leviathan is why we had back in Revelation the statement that there was no more sea in Revelation 21:1. There's no more sea because the chaotic, destructive power of the sea will be destroyed. And that is described as God defeating Leviathan in Isaiah 27:1. Leviathan doesn't show up just here. The longest single passage about Leviathan is in the book of Job, but I'm not going to read that chapter. I wanted to look at another place where Leviathan shows up in a comparable way to what we have in Isaiah 27. And this other passage about Leviathan is in Psalm 74. Psalm 74, verses 12 through 17. Yet God, my King, and there he is again as King, God, my King, is from of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. You split open springs and brooks. You dried up ever-flowing streams. Yours is the day, yours also the night. You have established the heavenly lights and the sun. You have fixed all the boundaries of the earth. You have made summer and winter. I continued on through verse 17 to give the idea that this is a creation account, creating day and night, establishing the heavenly lights and the sun, fixing the boundaries of the earth. And part of that, the earliest part of that, was dividing the sea by his might. Dividing the sea could mean that division of the waters above and below the firmament, and it could also mean him separating the dry land from the water. That was another kind of separation that tamed the sea and said that waters could come this far and no farther. And that's characterized in Psalm 74 as crushing the heads of Leviathan, God's creation power over the chaos of the sea. And in the new heaven and the new earth, there is no more sea because there is no chaotic powers like the power of Leviathan that would be destructive. I believe that is what Isaiah is also getting at when he talks about destroying the Leviathan in chapter 27:1. This is the equivalent to the revelation, there is no more sea, because in the perfection that Isaiah is describing in chapter 27, it is this ultimate new earth, which has God's intimate presence and no death and no Leviathan. Isaiah 27, verses 12 and 13. In that day, from the river Euphrates to the brook of Egypt, the Lord will thresh out the grain, and you will be gleaned one by one, O people of Israel. And in that day a great trumpet will be blown, and those who were lost in the land of Assyria, and those who were driven out to the land of Egypt, will come and worship the Lord on the holy mountain at Jerusalem. This is a picture of God calling together his people. Jesus uses the image of the angels gathering his people from the corners of the earth. That is like what Isaiah is describing here. Between the river Euphrates to the brook of Egypt, the Lord is gleaning or gathering what's left, like a remnant. This is a remnant picture, gleaning one by one the people of Israel, who were lost in the land of Assyria and driven to the land of Egypt. I believe that during Isaiah's lifetime, Egypt, as the place where Israel was essentially exiled until the Exodus, and Assyria, as the place where the northern tribes were literally exiled, are the two dominant figures of exile of Israelites. And God gathering his people from exile is the picture that on the day of judgment, the people who've been scattered to the winds are going to be gathered together. And the reason that the Euphrates on the one end and the brook of Egypt on the other are the picture is because during the time of the Assyrian Empire, the Euphrates River was a major border between the core of Assyria and the lands that would bleed into where Israel was and Judah. So on the west side of the Euphrates River were the lands that were associated with Israel, and on the east side of the Euphrates River was the land that was firmly in Assyrian territory. And then down towards Egypt, there's the Brook of Egypt. Now, if the Brook of Egypt means the Nile River, that's a little bit of a play on words, because the Nile is much more than a brook. But there may be some other body of water that I'm not familiar with that is called the Brook of Egypt. But whether it's the Nile River or something else, I think we're basically talking about this area between Egypt and Assyria. And what's in between? The promised land is in between. And God is going to bring his people back into that land on the judgment day. I think that's the picture that we have of Jesus talking about gathering his faithful people together. And it's just about the fact that God is going to bring his people out of exile and back into restored relationship with him in the new heaven and the new earth. It becomes embodied not just as the promised land generally, but as Jerusalem in particular, as he describes the new Jerusalem in Revelation 21 and 22. That is the place where everyone is gathered together who is loyal to God, from distant places into the presence of God in one place with him in the new Jerusalem. This section of Isaiah is full of these end times related pictures, because they are giving us that picture of God's ultimate day of the Lord, the wrath that's going to come on those who are unfaithful, like those heavenly hosts and the kings of the earth being put in prisons, imprisoned until their ultimate punishment, which Revelation would tell us is being thrown into the lake of fire, but also vindication for God's people being reclaimed from exile and blessed in the presence of God, where there is no more death, there is no more suffering, and there is a feast prepared on the mountain of the Lord. Thank you again for examining the treasures in Isaiah along with me. I'd love to hear your feedback and comments here on YouTube. And I always look forward to our next opportunity to examine the treasures in the biblical text. Until then, may the Lord be with you.